All right, let's dive into one of those conflicts that just, well, never seems to end. The DRC, Rwanda, and the M23 rebellion.
Yeah, a lot of layers to this one.
And sadly, this isn't just a headline from last week. It's a story with a long and tangled history.
It really is. And if you want to understand what's happening today, you have to dig into that history.
We're going beyond the surface level, right? Like, what's the real story behind all those headlines? The ethnicity, the regional power plays, the stuff that doesn't always make it into the news.
Exactly. Unraveling those hidden agendas, that's where things get really interesting.
So with a conflict this complex, where do we even start?
Well, you got to go back to 1994, the Rwandan genocide. Think about it. Millions of refugees fleeing across borders into neighboring countries, a lot of them ending up in the DRC.
Millions. Wow. That's hard to even imagine. What kind of impact did that have?
Well, the DRC was already a pretty fragile state dealing with its own issues.
Right.
And then suddenly this massive influx of refugees, some of whom were perpetrators of the genocide. I mean, you're talking about adding fuel to an already volatile situation, pure chaos. It set the stage for the First and Second Congo Wars.
Okay, so genocide triggers a refugee crisis, which destabilizes the region. And then, boom, 2 Congo Wars, from 96 to 2003. So where does Rwanda fit into all of this?
Well, Rwanda had just gone through this horrific genocide. They saw the DRC as a safe haven for the people who had participated in the killings, people they considered a direct threat.
Makes sense. So they felt like they had to do something.
Exactly. They supported various rebel groups inside the DRC.
To go after those perpetrators.
Yeah, they saw it as a matter of national security, protecting themselves from another potential genocide. And you have to remember, that perspective is still really strong in Rwanda today.
So the trauma of the genocide is still very much a driving force in their policy.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of the genocide, the refugee crisis, the Congo Wars. And somewhere in this mess, the M23 emerges. How did this group come about?
So there was this peace agreement in 2009. The Congolese government made a deal to integrate a Tutsi-led rebel group, the CNDP, mostly Congolese Tutsis. They were supposed to be absorbed into the national army.
Sounds like a good plan.
But a faction of that group felt like the government betrayed them, like they didn't hold up their end of the bargain.
So they break away.
And they take the name M23 after the date of that peace agreement.
Kind of ironic, isn't it? Named after the deal that was supposed to fix everything.
Yeah, a lot of broken promises in this story. And in 2012, they launch a new offensive, which really escalates the violence, gets the world's attention.
And that's where we get those accusations against Rwanda, right? Arming, training, basically directing the M23.
Right, and there's a lot of evidence for that, actually. UN reports, independent investigations, people on the ground saying, look, this is Rwanda, but Rwanda denies it, of course.
So who do you believe? How do you even begin to untangle the truth?
It's tough, right? There's this fog of war, so much misinformation, and everyone has an agenda. What you have to do is go beyond the rhetoric. Look at the evidence.
What kind of evidence?
The types of weapons being used, the tactics, the timing of the attacks, eyewitness accounts, putting all the pieces together.
So it's like detective work.
A bit of that, yeah.
All right, so we've got this internal conflict, M23 rebellion, intertwined with Rwanda's involvement.
Right.
And then fast forward to 2022, everything explodes again. This time, even more players get involved. Uganda, the US, France. It's like everyone wants a piece of the action. What happened? Why this sudden escalation?
There were several factors. Unresolved grievances from before, tensions between communities, a sense that the Congolese government wasn't taking the M23's concerns seriously, and, you've got all these other actors with their own interests in the region.
So it's not just about the DRC and Rwanda anymore.
Not at all.
It's more like a giant messy chess game.
With incredibly high stakes.
Yeah, definitely high stakes. And earlier you mentioned the human cost of this conflict. I mean, what does all of this fighting actually mean for the people on the ground?
Well, it's a humanitarian catastrophe. The fighting in North Kivu has displaced millions of people, a region that's already seen decades of violence.
It's hard to even comprehend that level of suffering.
And it's important to understand that North Kivu itself has a long history of Hutu-Tutsi tensions.
Oh, wow. So even within the DRC, there are these deep divisions. It's like a layer of complexity on top of complexity.
Exactly. And to really understand the present, you have to go back and look at how those ethnic tensions have been exploited, manipulated over time.
It's almost like a case study in how not to solve conflicts.
Oh.
I mean, we've got Historical grievances, ethnic tensions, regional power struggles, external actors meddling in everything.
And all of it fueled by something else, something we haven't even touched on yet.
What's that?
The DRC's resources.
Their vast mineral wealth.
That's right. The DRC has this incredible potential, but it's also a curse. It attracts international players who aren't always interested in peace.
They're after something else entirely.
Exactly. And that's something we need to explore in more depth.
We've been talking about this conflict that seems to go on, but surely there have been attempts to bring peace to the DRC, right?
Oh, absolutely. Tons of them. Problem is, none of them have really stuck.
And why is that? What makes it so hard to achieve lasting peace in this region?
It's complicated. You can't just, get everyone to sign a piece of paper and call it a day.
Right, it's about more than just silencing the guns. You've got to address those underlying causes.
Yeah, things like poverty and inequality. You can't build a peaceful society when people are desperate.
Makes sense. When people have opportunities, they're less likely to resort to violence.
Exactly. And then you throw in those ethnic tensions we talked about, which are often, manipulated by those in power.
So it's about creating a more just and equitable society.
Okay, so who's been involved in trying to make that happen? Is it just the DRC and Rwanda?
Oh, no, it's way more than that. You've got regional organizations like the East African Community, the African Union. They're trying to get the DRC and Rwanda talking, trying to stabilize the whole region.
And I imagine the UN is involved too, right? They usually are in these types of situations.
Oh, yeah, definitely. They have a huge peacekeeping force in the DRC, the biggest one in the world, actually.
So they're there to protect civilians, I guess.
Yeah, and to monitor human rights abuses and to support those peace processes we were talking about.
So we have all these groups, all these initiatives, but has any of it actually worked? Has there been any progress?
I mean, there have been moments of hope, times when things have calmed down a bit, but then something happens and it flares up all over again.
Like 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing.
Exactly. It's this cycle that just keeps repeating. It's so frustrating. So what makes it so hard to break free from this cycle? What's holding back progress?
Well, for one thing, there's this deep mistrust between all the different parties. Decades of violence, broken promises, It's like trying to build a bridge across a canyon of suspicion.
Yeah, it's hard to trust someone who's betrayed you over and over again. And what about those armed groups we talked about earlier? The ones that aren't necessarily part of the main conflict?
Yeah.
They can cause problems too. Right?
Oh, yeah, they can totally derail things. Some of them actually benefit from the chaos. Others just don't want peace for whatever reason. They sabotage the negotiations, they provoke violence just to keep things going.
So even if the DRC and Rwanda could somehow agree on something, those groups could just mess everything up.
Exactly. And you can't forget about those external actors we mentioned, like Rwanda and Uganda. They have their own agendas in the region, and their actions can either help or hurt the situation.
It really is like that chess game, isn't it? With all these different players making moves, trying to outmaneuver each other.
A very high-stakes chess game.
So with all these obstacles in the way, is peace even possible? I mean, why even bother trying? It seems like a lost cause.
You can't give up, though. The alternative is just too awful to think about. Millions of people have been displaced by this conflict, countless lives lost, a whole generation growing up surrounded by violence. Giving up on peace would be like saying all that suffering doesn't matter.
It's easy to get overwhelmed by all the complexities, to just throw your hands up and say, what's the point? But you're right, the human cost is too high to just ignore. Even small steps towards peace are important, right?
Every life saved. Every act of violence prevented, it all makes a difference. And, amidst all the darkness, there are these glimmers of hope. The Congolese people themselves are incredibly resilient.
They haven't given up.
Not at all. They're fighting for a better future, working to change things from within.
So it's not just about enduring suffering. It's about actively working for peace.
Exactly. You have all these amazing civil society groups in the DRC working tirelessly to promote peace, to provide aid to those who need it, to hold their leaders accountable.
It's a reminder that even in the most hopeless of situations, people can still find the strength to work for change. And it makes you realize how important it is to support those efforts, to amplify their voices, and to help them in any way we can.
It's crucial, because ultimately, lasting peace has to come from within. Imposing solutions from the outside just doesn't work.
So to recap, we've got this complex web of actors, a bunch of different peace initiatives, and the incredible strength and determination of the Congolese people. But the big question still remains. Can they actually achieve lasting peace? What will it take to finally break the cycle of violence and build a more stable and just future for the DRC?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a question we're going to explore in more detail in the final part of our deep dive. We'll look at potential paths to peace, what role international actors can play, and what factors might tip the scales towards a more hopeful future for the DRC.
Okay, so we've gone deep into this conflict. The history, the players, the struggles, well, the lack of peace. But now let's try to shift gears a bit. What about solutions? Can the DRC actually find lasting peace? And if so, how do they get there?
That's the big question everyone's asking, isn't it? Can this cycle of violence really be broken? I think it can, but it's going to be a long and difficult process. There's no magic wand, no single solution that's just going to make everything perfect. It's a process.
Okay, so no quick fixes.
Yeah.
But if it's a process, where do you even begin? What are some of the steps that need to be taken?
Well, we've talked about this a bit already, but addressing the root causes is absolutely essential. You have to tackle the poverty, the inequality, the lack of opportunity. When people feel like they have nothing to lose, that's when they become vulnerable to being recruited by armed groups. They become part of the problem.
So it's about more than just security. It's about building a society where peace is actually a real possibility.
Exactly. Economic development, education, healthcare, good governance, these are all crucial elements. And it's not just about top-down solutions either. You have to empower communities, give them the tools and resources to shape their own future.
That makes sense. But development takes time, and people are suffering right now. Are there things that can be done in the short term to reduce the violence, to kind of de-escalate things?
Right, yeah. You have to work on multiple timelines. In the short term, things like disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration programs, DDR for short, it's about helping ex-combatants, former fighters, to transition back to civilian life.
Giving them a way out.
Yeah, giving them an alternative to violence, a path to a normal life. And then there's security sector reform, strengthening the Congolese army and police, making them more professional, more accountable, making sure they protect people instead of preying on them.
Right, shifting from a culture of violence to a culture of law and order.
Yeah. Absolutely. And something else that's super important, you can't forget about justice and accountability. When people commit crimes, especially war crimes, they have to be held responsible.
Otherwise, it's just going to keep happening.
Yeah, impunity just breeds more violence. You need justice, you need reconciliation to truly heal those wounds of the past.
Okay, so we've got those internal strategies. Addressing the root causes, DDR, security sector reform, justice, and accountability.
Yeah.
But we've also talked a lot about the role of the international community. Can they really just sit back and watch this all unfold?
Oh, no, not at all. The DRC conflict is a global problem, and it needs a global solution. International actors have a huge role to play. They can provide financial aid, technical expertise, they can use their diplomatic clout to pressure the parties involved. They can create a more supportive environment for peace.
But we've also talked about how international involvement can be a double-edged sword.
Right.
I mean, how do we know they're really committed to peace and not just pursuing their own interests? Like we said before, it's a chess game and everyone's trying to win.
That's true, and it's a valid concern. But international engagement has to be transparent, accountable, and focused on the needs of the Congolese people. It can't just be about what each country can get out of it. It has to be about genuine cooperation, working together to create a better future for everyone.
A win-win situation for all involved. So to wrap things up, what does this all mean for our listeners? You've taken this deep dive with us, explored all the complexities of this conflict. What are you going to do with this knowledge? What can you take away from all of this?
Well, the DRC conflict may seem far away, but it's a reminder that peace is fragile, that injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere. It's also a reminder that people are resilient and they never give up hope, even in the darkest of times, and that we can make a difference, even in small ways.
So, thinking about what you've learned today, what role can you play in promoting peace and justice? Not just in the DRC, but in your own communities and beyond. Because building peace is something we all have to work on.
Right, it starts with each of us. Educate yourself, support organizations doing good work, speak out against injustice. Every little bit helps. Because ultimately, we all want the same thing, a more peaceful and just world.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the DRC conflict. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.